Before we get into today's video, we want to bring you a message from our amazing sponsor, Untitled. Are you looking for something that is fun and inexpensive that you can do at home? Why not try to solve a murder? Untitled is an amazing subscription service where every month they send you a box of clues regarding a murder, and the clues help you identify the killer. The evidence includes codes you have to decipher and puzzles you have to solve. The props are amazing. They look like they came from the set of a TV show or a movie. Hunted Killer boxes are a lot like escape rooms, but you get to do it from the safety of your own home. I've played a few seasons of Hunted Killer and I'm obsessed with it. I can't wait for the next season to come out so I can get into it. Right now, just for our viewers, you can go to hunterkiller.com/criminallylisted and use criminally listed at the checkout for 20% off your first box. Once again, make sure you use the promo code criminally listed for a 20% discount and to show your support for our channel. Now, you just have to ask yourself, do you have what it takes to hunt a killer? Number 3. Tony Muncy. Richard Pestle lived in Galeno, Ohio, which is a village about 20 miles from downtown Columbus. On the morning of October 16, 1983, Pestle drove to a store in nearby Delaware, Ohio, to buy some milk. As he drove home, he watched for a deer on the side of the road. Instead, he saw something odd on the side of the road. It was 3 garbage bags. It looked like an elbow was coming out of one of the bags. Pestle pulled over and got a closer look at the bags. He realized that it wasn't an elbow. Instead, it was a human leg. Pestle got in contact with the sheriff's department. Inside the bags were the dismembered remains of a teenage boy. He was nude, and some of his clothes were in the bags. The medical examiner thought he had been dead less than 24 hours. The police were able to determine that the victim was 15-year-old John Muncy, who went by the name Tony. Tony was in the 9th grade, and he loved hard rock bands like AC/DC and Kiss. Tony lived with his family on the east side of Columbus. The night before Tony's body was found, he had gone out to see his girlfriend, and he was planning on spending the night at a friend's home. So when Tony didn't come home that night, his parents weren't worried. Unfortunately, Tony never made it to his friend's home. The police thought that Tony was killed elsewhere, possibly Columbus, and then his body was dumped on the side of the road. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds to the back. The medical examiner concluded that Tony had been stabbed while he was still dressed. There was a hole in his jacket that appeared to have been made by a knife. The medical examiner thought that after he was killed, he was undressed. The medical examiner did not find any evidence of sexual assault. Tony's body was then mutilated and dismembered. Blood that was found on some evidence was tested. The results revealed that there were 2 different blood types. The police concluded that the second blood type was the killer's blood. But since it was 1983, the police couldn't do much else with the blood. The police had no suspects or leads, and it wasn't long before the brutal murder went cold. 27 years later, in 2010, the police reopened the case. They had a DNA profile made, but they couldn't find a match to it. Then, 8 years later, the investigators heard about a cold case in Snohomish County, Washington, that was solved after 31 years. It was the murders of 20-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg. We cover their case in the videos 3 Unsolved Mysteries with Mysterious Letters Part 3 and 3 major updates on cases previously featured on Criminally Listed. DNA technology company Parabon Nanolabs was responsible for the break in the case. Using GEDmatch, which is an online database of DNA profiles, they were able to find distant relatives of the killer. Then they filled out the branches of the relative's family tree until it led them to the identity of the killer. It's a process that's called forensic genealogy. In the case of Cook and Van Cuylenborg, the killer was William Earl Talbot II. In June 2019, Talbot became the first person convicted of murder after being identified by forensic genealogy. Talbot was given 2 life sentences. The investigators working on Tony Muncy's case got in touch with Parabon Nanolabs and they agreed to help. In April 2020, the police in Columbus announced that the case had been solved. Parabon Nanolabs had narrowed it down to 3 brothers. The police were able to eliminate 2 of the brothers as suspects. The 3rd brother was Daniel Allen Anderson. The police did not release many details about Anderson. What is known about him is that he was born and raised in Columbus. When Tony was murdered, Anderson was 30 years old. Anderson had a criminal record which included acts of violence against young boys. However, it was too late for Daniel Anderson to face justice for what he did. Anderson died in 2013 at the age of 60. The police now consider the murder of John Tony Muncy to be closed. Number 2. Peggy Beck. In the summer of 1963, Margaret Beck, who went by the name Peggy, was 16 years old. She lived in Edgewater, Colorado, which is a municipality west of Denver. Peggy lived with her parents and her 3 sisters. When Peggy was 9, she joined the Girl Scouts. In that summer of 1963, 16-year-old Peggy was made a Girl Scout counselor. On August 14th, Peggy was at the Flying G Ranch Girl Scouts camp near Decker, Colorado. She was on a 5-day trip with 105 Girl Scouts who were between the ages of 12 and 14, and there was also 27 supervisors. Many of the supervisors were mothers of the Girl Scouts. Peggy and another counselor, Claudia Stride, were sharing a tent. On the last night of the trip, Claudia wasn't feeling well, so she stayed in the infirmary. The next morning, Peggy didn't come to breakfast. Claudia went to their tent and she found Peggy still in her sleeping bag. Claudia thought she was still sleeping. It turned out that 16-year-old Peggy Beck was dead. The leaders of the Girl Scout group thought that Peggy had died of natural causes. The day Peggy was found dead was the last scheduled day of camp. So they kept her death a secret and had all the campers pack up. Claudia cleaned up the tent where Peggy died and she took everything out of it. 8 hours after Peggy was found dead, the sheriff's department was notified. When Peggy's body was transferred to the morgue, it was still in the sleeping bag. At the morgue, her body was removed from the sleeping bag, and an employee noted something alarming. Peggy's leotards and her underwear had been ripped. An autopsy was immediately ordered. The medical examiner quickly concluded that 16-year-old Peggy Beck had been murdered. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The medical examiner noted that Peggy put up a fight. Some of her fingernails were broken. The FBI assisted with the case. They collected the scrapings from under the fingernails. The police interviewed everyone who was at the camp. Peggy was sleeping in a tent that was about 75 feet from the closest tent. No one at the camp saw or heard anything unusual. The police followed up on several leads, but no one ever went to trial for the murder. The police thought it was unlikely that they would solve the case. They thought that any evidence that may have existed had accidentally been cleaned up by one of the Girl Scouts. Decades went by, and the murder of Peggy Beck was largely forgotten. In 2007, the case was reopened. Amazingly, the scrapings from under Peggy's fingernails have been saved and preserved. Using the scrapings, the police were able to get a DNA profile of the killer. However, they did not find a match to the DNA. 12 years later, in 2019, the case was examined again. In June 2019, the police got an improved DNA profile. They gave the profile to a company called United Data Connect. United Data Connect is a computer science company that does familial DNA searches. They were able to trace the DNA to a suspect. In April 2020, the police announced that the killer's name was James Raymond Taylor. At the time of the murder, Taylor was 24 years old and he was working as a TV repairman. In the 1960s, Taylor lived in Edgewater, which is the same municipality where Peggy lived with her family. Edgewater is over 60 miles from the campground. It's unknown if Taylor knew Peggy before he killed her or if he targeted her. It may have just been a coincidence that they both lived in the same municipality. Taylor was known to go to the campground where the murder happened to test ham radios that he had built. After the police got the DNA results, they tried to track down Taylor, who had been 81 years old. They aren't sure when he moved away from Colorado, but in the early 1970s, he was living in Las Vegas, Nevada. He had a rap sheet in Nevada, but the police did not give details about his criminal record. The last time anyone saw or heard from Taylor was in 1976. At the time, he was still living in Las Vegas, Nevada. There is currently a warrant for the arrest of James Raymond Taylor, but the police suspect that he may be dead. If he is still alive, the police want him to face justice for the brutal murder he committed. Margaret Peggy Beck's murder was solved after 56 years. The investigators believe it was the oldest case solved by genealogical testing found at a crime scene. Number 1. Jacalyn Harp, Irene Blase, and Denise Falasca. On October 30th, 1967, two girls in Montvale, New Jersey were playing in an upstairs bedroom in their house. They looked out the window, and on the street below, they noticed something odd. It looked like there was a mannequin in the back seat of a car. The girls decided to get a closer look. After they looked in the car, they ran to their neighbor's home, and their neighbor called the police. What they had found was the dead body of a woman. The police determined that she was 29-year-old Nancy Vogel. Vogel was married and she had 2 children. Vogel lived about 2 miles away from where her body was found. She was last seen alive 3 nights before her body was found. She had told her husband she was going to play bingo at a local Catholic church. She then drove off in her car, which was the car her body was found in. The police learned that Vogel never made it to Bingo. In the car, the police found some shopping bags, so they suspected she went to a nearby shopping center before Bingo. The police thought it was probably there that she encountered her killer. It's believed that Vogel was killed on the night she went missing, and her body was left in the parked car for 3 days. Vogel was naked, and her clothes were found under her body. They were neatly folded. Her wrists had been bound in front of her with a thin nylon rope. Vogel had been sexually assaulted, and then she was strangled and beaten to death. It's thought that the killer beat her with his fists. After about a week, the police considered the case cold. 10 years later, the case still had not been solved, and it was mostly forgotten. On the night of December 15, 1977, the husband of 26-year-old X-ray technician Marianne Carr was out of town on business. Carr and her husband lived in an apartment building called Ledwidge Terrace in Little Ferry, New Jersey. That night, Carr was supposed to meet up with her mother-in-law, but she didn't show up. The next day, Carr's body was found beside a motel's parking lot in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. She had died a horrific death. Handcuffs had been placed on her wrists and her ankles, and her mouth was covered with duct tape. She had been struck in the face with a blunt object and strangled with some type of ligature. She also had a vicious bite mark on her left breast. The police interviewed Carr's neighbors, and one of them told the police something interesting. On the night of the murder, she was sure that she saw Carr's husband in the parking lot. But the police were able to confirm that there was no way that Carr's husband could have killed her because he wasn't in town. It wasn't long before Carr's case went cold. The police had no idea that the murders of Carr and Vogel were connected. After all, they happened in different cities, a decade apart. 9 months after Carr's murder, on September 23, 1973, a woman was found in a drainage ditch behind Ledwidge Terrace, which is the apartment building where Carr lived. The woman had been beaten and strangled, and there were bite marks on her breast. The woman was nearly dead. She was taken to the hospital, and doctors saved her life. The woman could not remember the night before too clearly. She had been at a bar in New York City, and she was drinking with a man who said his name was John Schaefer. She was sure she had been drugged. Testing was done, and the woman had been given a cocktail of 2 drugs. Since the woman couldn't remember much about the man or the attack, the police did not think that they had many leads to follow up on. Less than 3 months later, the police in Hackensack, New Jersey were called to a motel. A sex worker had been drugged and beaten up. She also had several bite marks on her breasts. The woman told the police that the night before she went to a bar with a client who called himself Jim. Jim said he was a computer operator. He also said that he was married and he had 3 children. The woman said that she and Jim went back to the motel room. She said that after she had a sip of her drink, things got hazy. The next thing she knew, it was morning and she was in a lot of pain. Once again, the police made little progress in solving the case. On December 2, 1980, firefighters were called to a motel in mid-Manhattan. A fire had broken out in one of the rooms. Inside the room, they found the dead bodies of 2 women. It was clear that they were dead before the fire was started. Their heads and hands were missing. The medical examiner noted that the two women had been tortured before they were killed. Their breasts had superficial cuts. Just over a month later, one of the women was identified. She was 22-year-old Didi Gudarzi. She was a sex worker and mother of one. The other woman has never been identified. Their hands and their heads have never been found. On May 4th, 1980, a housekeeper working at a motel in Hasbrook Heights noticed an odd smell in the room that she was cleaning. She lifted the mattress, and under the bed was the dead body of a young woman. The body was later determined to be 19-year-old Valerie Ann Street. Street was a sex worker. The medical examiner thought that she had been tortured for hours before she was killed. Her wrists had handcuffs on them, and duct tape was wrapped around her head. Her breasts had noticeable bite marks on them. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. One investigator realized that Mary Ann Carr's body had been dumped beside the parking lot of the same motel about 2.5 years earlier. A week later, on May 12th, a severely injured woman was found in a parking lot in Teaneck, New Jersey. The woman, who was a cocktail waitress, had been drugged and beaten. Her breasts had also been bitten. The woman survived the brutal assault. Just 10 days later, on May 15th, firefighters responded to a hotel fire in New York City. Inside a burnt-out room, the dead, mutilated body of a woman was found. There were bite marks on her body. Her breasts had been removed, and they were on the headboard. The police determined through fingerprints that the body was 25-year-old Jean Rayner. Rayner was a sex worker who was known to work Times Square. The police in New York were sure that this killer was the same person who killed Didi Gudarzi and the Jane Doe about 6 months earlier because of the similarities in the crime scenes. However, they had no idea who the killer was. Just a week later, on May 22, 1980, the police were called to a motel in Hasbrook Heights. It was the same motel where Mary Ann Carr and Valerie Ann Street's bodies were found. A guest had reported a woman screaming. The police went to the motel room and a woman opened the door a crack. The officers could tell something was wrong and they managed to get into the room. When they did, a man ran out the back door. They chased after him and he was arrested. The woman, who was a sex worker, was taken to the hospital. She had been tortured for hours before she was found, but she ultimately survived her injuries. The man who was arrested was identified as 34-year-old Richard Cottingham. Cottingham was a computer operator at Blue Shield of Greater New York. He was married and he had 3 children. Cottingham and his family lived in Lodi, New Jersey. After Cottingham was arrested, the police suspected that he might be responsible for the murders of Mary Ann Carr and Valerie Ann Street. Not only were their bodies found at the same motel, but they had all suffered bites to the breasts. Also, Carr's neighbor was sure that she saw Carr's husband in the parking lot of their building on the night Carr was murdered. But that wasn't possible because Carr's husband was out of town on the night of the murder. It turned out Cottingham looked a lot like Carr's husband. Cottingham also had a connection to the apartment building where Carr lived. The woman Cottingham was dating at the time of the murder, who later became his wife, lived in the same building as Carr. When Cottingham was questioned, he denied assaulting the woman in the motel room. He said that everything that went on was consensual. He also denied knowing Harp and Street, and he said he didn't kill them. The police got a search warrant for Cottingham's home. He had a private room in the basement that his family was forbidden from entering. Inside of it, the detectives found trophies that Cottingham had taken from his victims, like jewelry. The police in Bergen County, where all the New Jersey murders took place, and the New York Police Department worked together. The investigators concluded that Cottingham had killed Dee Dee Goodarzi, the Jane Doe, and Jean Rayner. Two of the women who had survived their attacks also picked Cottingham out of a lineup. Richard Cottingham was charged with a plethora of crimes. This included 5 counts of murder. Those were the murders of Marianne Carr, Dee Dee Goodarzi, the Jane Doe, Valerie Street, and Jean Rayner. In 3 different trials, Cottingham was convicted of all 5 murders. He was given 3 different sentences, 173 to 197 years, 20 years to life, and 75 years to life. When Cottingham was arrested, the police did not connect him to the murder of 29-year-old Nancy Vogel in October 1967. Over the years, the police interviewed Cottingham in prison. In 2010, Cottingham confessed to the murder of Nancy Vogel. Cottingham, who was 21 years old at the time of the murder, said he encountered Vogel at the shopping center. In August 2010, Cottingham pleaded guilty to Vogel's murder, and he was given another life sentence. After that, the police continued to periodically visit Cottingham in prison. In 2019, Cottingham confessed to 3 more murders. On July 17, 1968, 13-year-old Jacalyn Harp was walking home from band practice in Midland Park, New Jersey. When she didn't make it home that evening, she was reported missing by her parents. The next day, Jacalyn's body was found in a wooded area just a few blocks from her home. She had been strangled to death with a leather strap that she was carrying. She had not been sexually assaulted. It appeared that her face was beaten after she was dead. On April 7, 1969, 18-year-old Irene Blase, who lived in Bogota, New Jersey, took a bus from Bogota to Hackensack. She was last seen talking to a man in his 20s at the bus station in Hackensack. The next morning, her body was found about 3 miles from the bus station, floating in the Saddle River in Saddle Brook, New Jersey. She was fully clothed, and she had not been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was strangulation. Blase wore a crucifix on a chain, and she was strangled with the chain. There were also some wounds on her face that appeared to be made post-mortem. It is thought that the killer punched her in the face after she had died. 3 months later, on the evening of July 14, 1969, 15-year-old Denise Falasca left her family's home in Gloucester, New Jersey, on foot. She told her parents she was going to see some friends. It turned out that she had lied, and she had never intended to see her friends. What she was planning to do that night is unknown. The next day, her body was found near a cemetery in Saddle Brook. Her body was found just a few blocks from where Irene Blase's body was found. Like Irene, Denise had been strangled to death with the chain of a crucifix that she wore. After she was dead, it appears that the killer struck her in the face several times. She was fully clothed, and there were no signs of sexual assault. All 3 murders happened in Bergen County. At the time of the murders, Richard Cottingham was living in Little Ferry, which is in Bergen County. Jacalyn Harp was killed about 8 months after Cottingham killed Nancy Vogel. He would have been 21 years old when he killed Jacalyn. Although Richard Cottingham lived in the county where the murders took place, he wasn't seriously considered a suspect. That was because the murders that Cottingham committed later were so much more vicious and they involved torture. In early 2020, the police announced that after months of investigating, they were confident that Richard Cottingham was the killer of the 3 young women and they were closing their cases. What is odd is that Jacalyn Harp, Irene Blase, and Denise Falasca were not the only teenage girls to be killed in Bergen County in the late 1960s. It was believed that all the young women were murdered by a serial killer known as the Bergen Strangler. The first suspected victim of the Bergen Strangler was 18-year-old Alice Jean Eberhard. At 2:30 p.m. on September 24, 1965, Eberhard left the Hackensack Hospital where she was a student nurse. Eberhard lived with her parents in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. After Eberhard left the hospital, there was an intense thunderstorm in the area. Eberhard's father arrived home at about 5:30 p.m. that day. He found the house trashed. He then found the dead body of his daughter in one of the rooms. It appeared that Eberhard put up a fight, and that's why the house was trashed. She was nude from the waist down, but she had not been sexually assaulted. It is thought that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. She had also been stabbed 61 times, and it's believed she was stabbed after she was dead. The 2 knives used to stab her came from the Eberhard's home. The police suspected that the killer knew Eberhard. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry, so it's quite possible that Eberhard let the killer into her home. The police also suspected that it was someone that Eberhard knew because she was only home alone for a few hours. This suggested that the killer knew her schedule. The murder of Alice Jean Eberhard happened nearly 2 years before Nancy Vogel was killed. Vogel is Cottingham's first confirmed victim. When Eberhard was killed, Cottingham was 19 years old and he was living in River Valley, which is in Bergen County. The next murder happened on April 4th, 1966, about 6 months after Eberhard was killed. 18-year-old Janet Ibstrow lived in Paramus, New Jersey. She was married on April 2nd, 1966. 2 days later, she was found brutally murdered in the apartment that she shared with her husband. She had been strangled to death with her hairnet. After she was dead, she was stabbed in the heart with a pair of scissors. She was nearly nude, but she had not been sexually assaulted. The last time she was seen alive was about 2 hours before her body was discovered. She had gone to a hardware store to buy cleaning supplies, and then she was seen walking home. Nearly 10 months later, on January 24th, 1967, 17-year-old Marianne Della Sala left her work and started walking home. Marianne lived in Hackensack. She didn't make it home, and she was reported missing. 80 days later, her semi-nude body was found floating in the Passaic River in Hawthorne, New Jersey. She had not been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death and struck in the face. About 7 months later, Jacalyn Harp was strangled to death, which was followed by the strangulation murder of Irene Blase 9 months later, and then 3 months after that, Denise Falasca was killed by strangulation. People thought that one killer was responsible for all 6 murders because of the striking similarities between the cases. All 6 murders happened within 3 years and 9 months of each other. All the victims lived in, were killed in, and their bodies were found in Bergen County. All the victims were similar in age, ranging from 13 to 18. They were all petite, fair skin, and had brown or brownish red hair. All the victims, except for the first, were strangled with something that they were wearing or something that they had in their possession. The first victim was stabbed with 2 knives that were found in her house. That meant the killer didn't carry a weapon with him. Also, many of the victims had been beaten or mutilated after death. Finally, the murders seemed to have a sexual element to them, but none of the victims were sexually assaulted. Did Richard Cottingham kill Alice Jean Eberhardt, Janet Ipsaro, and Marianne Della Sala? If so, why did he not confess to them when he confessed the other 3 murders? Or were the first 3 murders committed by another serial killer? Or even 3 separate killers? One thing to note is that the first 3 murders, which Cottingham didn't confess to, happened before the murder of Nancy Vogel, his first confirmed victim. The 3 murders that he did confess to were committed after Vogel was killed. Richard Cottingham is also the prime suspect in several other murders. On August 9, 1974, 17-year-old Marianne Pryor and 16-year-old Lorraine Kelly went to a mall in Paramus, New Jersey, which is in Bergen County. Their nude bodies were found in a wooded area in Montvale, New Jersey, 6 days after they went missing. They had been bound at the wrists and ankles. They were sexually assaulted and beaten. It's believed that they were strangled to death with a ligature. At the time of their murders, Richard Cottingham was 27 years old, and he was living in Little Ferry. The double homicide happened about 2.5 years before Marianne Carr was killed. Carr's murder was the first in a series of 5 murders which Cottingham was arrested and convicted of. One thing that the investigators noted was that Marianne Pryor and Lorraine Kelly's bodies were dumped in Montvale, which is a small borough in Bergen County. In the 1970s, Montvale had a population of around 7,000 people. It was the borough where Cottingham had dumped Nancy Vogel's body 7 years earlier. On January 13, 1979, the body of 19-year-old Helen Sykes was found in a wooded area near LaGuardia Airport in Queens, New York. Sykes was a sex worker who was known to hang out around Times Square looking for clients. She had been stabbed multiple times and her throat was slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. Her legs had been removed and they weren't near her body. They were found 3 days later in an alley a few blocks away. What is notable is that Sykes' body had bite marks on it. Sykes was killed about 11 months before Dee Godarzi and the Jane Doe were murdered in New York. Godarzi and Jane Doe were the second and third victims in the series of 5 murders that Cottingham was convicted of. Cottingham is still in prison serving those sentences. Even though the police consider the cases of Jacalyn Harp, Irene Blase, and Denise Falasca to be closed after Cottingham confessed to killing them, he has not been charged with their murders. Richard Cottingham, who is nicknamed the Torso Killer and the Times Square Ripper, is currently incarcerated at the Trenton State Prison in Trenton, New Jersey. At the time of this video, he is 73 years old. Since being in prison, Cottingham has confessed to 4 murders. So it's believed that the police will continue to visit him in prison to see if he'll confess to any other murders. Thank you so much for watching today's video. We hope you found it interesting. If you're looking for some new videos to watch, why not check out my new channel, Chapter Dark, and see if you can solve the mysteries in the videos. If you like riddles, puzzles, or escape rooms, Chapter Dark will be right up your alley. A link to Chapter Dark should appear on the screen momentarily, and you can also find a link in the description box below this video. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, we'd really appreciate it if you gave us a thumbs up. Please also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Roku. The links are in the description box. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching, and please stay safe.